Chapter 4. As Billy and Ramirez stood there frozen and helpless, Schaefer moved into the clearing, kneeling beside the bloody pile of clothing and entrails. He examined the discarded gear carefully, turning it over, then stood up holding a dog tag on a broken chain. His expression grew stony, his face taut and strained as he stared at the tag, recognizing the name. J.S. Davis, Captain, U.S. Army. He read out loud, toneless and grim. His bewildered eyes moved from the dog tag up to the gutted bodies. He swallowed once, and a muscle in his jaw fluttered for a second. Then he turned and faced the 6 men who stood pale and dumbstruck at the clearing's edge. "Cut them down, Mac," he instructed coldly. The evenness of his voice masked a rage beyond a mere soldier's revenge after a bloody battle. Davis and Schaefer had a long history together. Since boot camp nearly 20 years ago, they had been mates and comrades. They'd barely squeaked out with their skins on a secret mission in Malaysia in '79. Davis was the best chopper pilot in the business, and he'd twice come in under fire to scoop Dutch up. Silently, Schaefer vowed to destroy whoever had desecrated his friend. Now it was private, between him and the enemy. He would walk through hell to make them pay. Mac moved forward, obeying Schaefer's command. He shimmied up the tree and one by one cut the bodies down. With a slice of his razor-edged combat knife, the severed vine released the first corpse, and it fell with a sickly thud to the ground. Then the second, then the third. The men stood around like an honor guard, too proud to fall apart, steeling themselves till the shock had passed, knowing that as with Schaefer, it would quickly slide into rage and make them strong again. Mac bent over the bloody pile, picking out the other 2 dog tags. At last, Schaefer turned to Dylan, who had been standing silently like the others, mouth still agape, as incapacitated as the men he was meant to lead. "I knew this man," said the Major, holding the dog tag close to Dylan's face, swaying it like a hypnotist. "Green Beret out of Fort Bragg. What the hell was he doing here? Last I heard, he was running taxi service to Camp David, transporting the big man's sheepdog. He needed a tour of jungle duty like he needed a second dick. So what's he doing getting himself scalped in this jerkwater 2-bit country? You got any answers to that, Dylan?" he demanded angrily. It's inhuman, that's what it is," Dylan replied with difficulty. "I'm sorry, Dutch. I don't know. Maybe we should call the ACLU, huh? See if we can file a little complaint. All nice and typed, you know?" His voice was thick with contempt. "Look, Dutch, I wasn't told about any covert operations in this area. They shouldn't have been here. I would have known." "Well, somebody sent them," Schaefer snapped, unsatisfied and irritated. As of this moment, he was clearly uninterested in official bullshit. He walked off as Max stepped out of the clearing, sheathing his knife with a violent gesture as he passed Ramirez. "Must have run into gorillas. Fucking animals," growled Ramirez. He wiped his sweaty, dirt-encrusted brow with his forearm, then realized his hands were shaking. He shoved them violently into his pockets. Everyone was trying to understand, to throw together some rational reason how this thing could have happened. None of them had ever seen such barbaric treatment by an enemy. Not in Cambodia, not in Lebanon, not in all of their combined years of combat service, which probably amounted to a century. Deep down, they still believed that between enemies there was an unwritten code, setting limits to the degree of torture inflicted, at least among so-called professional soldiers. This was so far beyond the code that they didn't even have context for it. Why strip a man of his skin? Why bother? There were so many easier ways to hurt. It was like some demented autopsy. "Ain't no way for a soldier to die," Max said tightly to Blaine, hawking a yellow-brown stream of chew saliva that landed on a banana flower, drooling to the ground. "Time to get old Painless out," he added with relish. He ripped at the Velcro closures on the canvas bag draped over his shoulder and pulled out his baby, a 6-barreled automatic adapted for field combat. It caught the sun's rays and glimmered darkly, deadly as a portable minefield. Billy had meanwhile moved a short distance ahead of the others and was examining the ground beyond the carnage. He plucked at the beaten grass several times, as if he were picking up coins. Then he stood and held out for Schaefer to see a handful of spent cartridges. Dutch walked over to him. "What happened here, Billy?" he asked quietly, sensing the younger man's churning mind as he desperately struggled to put it together. Schaefer knew well that of all of his men, Billy had the most intuitive feel for unravelling a puzzle. Billy moved to a subtler rhythm, his ears tuned to a higher pitch. Schaefer used to tell him he was part bird dog, part witch doctor. "I don't get it, Major," Billy said haltingly. Yet as always, he was stubbornly certain, no matter how mismatched the evidence seemed. "There was a firefight here, shooting in all directions, like 400-500 rounds. I can't believe Jack Davis walked straight into an ambush, even if he was a prisoner," Schaefer retorted, recalling his dead friend's radar. Davis had eyes at the back of his head. Nothing had ever taken him by surprise. In that, he was just like Schaefer himself. The whole idea of an ambush was an insult. "No, it wasn't like that, sir," Billy agreed. "Besides, there's not a single track to show what they were shooting at. It's like they were firing like crazy into the air. It just doesn't make any sense." Billy scratched the stubble on his chin and brooded for a moment. "And I don't know where the fuck those guys with the new boots went. They must have turned off somewhere." "Wait a minute. What about the rest of Jack's men?" Schaefer was vehement. It was as if he wanted to slap Billy back to reality, whatever that was. "Where's the guerrillas who took them out of the chopper? And where's the goddamn politicians?" He was practically yelling now. Billy shook his head. "No sign," he said simply. "But they never left here, Major." Then, shying at the mystery of it, even as he told it, he added awkwardly, "It's like they kind of disappeared." Schaefer struggled a moment, grappling to form a strategy in his head. Then, with a huge effort of will, he instructed bluntly, "Find me a trail, Billy. I want to blow me away some guerrillas." Turning to the rest of the team, he barked, "Okay guys, funeral's over. Let's keep moving. 5 meters spread, don't even breathe." Like lightning, the Major had thrown all systems to full throttle, which in his case was several cylinders more explosive than an 18-wheeler. But he simply couldn't endure ambiguity and inaction. It was as if his muscles and mind together suddenly snapped to attention, senses cued for anything and everything. His veins pumped with adrenaline as he whipped himself up to combat mode, all engines power on, into a force of near superhuman prowess. The others quickly geared up too, following Schaefer like a coach. Though none could match his uncanny stamina or his brute single-mindedness, at least they could keep pace with him. Psyching themselves up for an encounter with whoever was responsible for the senseless torture and desecration, the men readied themselves for battle, each in his own way. Blaine fed a magazine of belted shells into his weapon, cocking it till it ached to shoot. He looked up at Mac as he loaded. Mac re-tied his boots with total absorption, stringing them up and pulling them tight, as if the exact tension mattered. He would live or die by the lacing of his boots. Dylan jotted a compass reading into his notebook. Ramirez absent-mindedly polished his black pearl ring on the sleeve of his fatigues. Hawkins adjusted the pins on 2 grenades and clipped them onto his belt, then drew out a comb and eased it through his black Irish hair. But at some moment in the elaborate ritual, each managed to exchange half a second's glance with the others. They acknowledged their camaraderie obliquely, but somehow understanding the mix of signals in one another's eyes, the anger, the fear, the lifeblood support. And twined through it all, like the grip of a vine in a cottonwood tree, was the certainty of death. Their mates, their enemies, their own. A match had been lit deep in the mine, and the fuel that would feed the fire might turn out to be the whole dark earth itself. "Payback time," Blaine declared, with controlled rage, as he hefted the gun and poised the butt of it onto his hip. Mac drew back on the breech bolt of his M60, letting it snap into fire position. They grinned at each other, ready to find and face Gooks, Huns, and Tartars. The blood warrior hue of their faces, streaked with camouflage grease, was in strange contrast to their high-tech combat gear. It was like Hannibal crossing the Alps with V-1 rockets on the elephants' backs. Mac and Blaine, heading out in tandem, urged each other forward, a constant dare playing between them. That, and the memory of the brutal murders they'd just discovered, made them hungry to shoot first and ask no questions at all. If somebody innocent got in their way, so be it. Mac and Blaine didn't get all misty-eyed about innocence. Just as well not to ask them their opinions about my lie. And observing them from the highest branches of a densely leafed baobab tree, the invader didn't miss a beat. Incapable of guilt or rage or fear or pity, unable to understand that which it had done to the dead was a vile dishonor, it absorbed the marching commandos through its heat-sensitive optic cells. It hid so deep in the tree that it was impossible to say what form it took, whether monkey or crow or something more mutant. If one of the men had looked straight into the leaves with binoculars, he might have caught the yellow gleam of an eye. But the eye was only a nexus of nerves, spun from its own secretions like an insect's nest. Though it stared and took in everything, it did not need to see or to comprehend. It had evolved beyond such concepts eons ago. Yet still, it could not stop looking. The men below knew nothing beyond themselves. Each took his own measure and adapted himself to the brutal terrain, blocking out everything but forward movement and absolute silence. Even with his enormous bulk, Mac moved gracefully, soundlessly through the jungle. As he stepped along light as a deer, Dylan followed 5 meters behind. The black man accidentally stepped on the broken branch of a felled tree, his foot crunching through the rotting, grub-infested wood. A chunk broke loose and rolled down the hill, gathering bark and gravel, finally landing at the base of a rock with a thunk. Not a lot of noise, but it couldn't have been made by anything else but a man. At once, Dylan cringed and tightened into a defensive posture, listening for any signs that he had given away their position. The jungle was unmoved as he strained his eyes and ears, terrified he'd announced the team's presence to the enemy. Accidents were not permissible under the tense circumstances. Dylan felt like a horse's ass. This never would have happened if he'd only had a couple of days to get himself in shape. 24 hours ago, he was sitting dazed at his desk at Langley, being given the sudden orders for this mission. He had a bad ache in his calf muscle, and he'd managed to twist his back tripping over a root. Horse's ass was right. As Dylan listened, teeth gritted at his own stupidity, Mac appeared silently from behind a bush, parting its broad leaves. He stood within inches of Dylan's face, eyes burning with contempt and anger. "You're ghosting on me, motherfucker," he hissed, spraying spittle in the black man's face. "I don't give a shit what kind of big dick you got in Washington. You give away my position again, and I'll bleed you quiet and leave your fucking ass right here. And you can write your fucking senator if you don't like it. Got it, pal?" Dylan glared back in cold hatred, but he didn't answer back. He was stalemated by combat rules he knew as well as Mac, and he'd just broken them. Mac turned and vanished into the undergrowth. When his gun was cocked, Mac didn't give 2 squats about the chain of command. Even at the best of times, he didn't call anyone sir, not even Schaefer. Dylan was left thrown and speechless, staring at the rustle of leaves that had swallowed Mac. But Dylan didn't have any recourse, official or otherwise. He picked up the trail again, this time watching every footfall. Meanwhile, Mac had caught up with Blaine, who was crouched beneath a banana palm, chewing quietly on a banana, absorbing the texture of his surroundings. He looked more like a gorilla than usual. Mac sidled up to him, and they spoke in whispers. "Say, Bull, what's going down? We got movement?" "Nah," Mac murmured. "Shithead with the trench coat was making enough racket to get us all waxed." "Don't let him get too close behind you, huh? You don't want to wind up skinned, like a rabbit." He chuckled hoarsely, his voice strained from whispering. Then he wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. Sweat, mixed with dust and melting grease, was dripping into his eyes, stinging and clouding his vision. Blaine patted his weapon affectionately. "I hear you, Bull," he nodded. "But don't sweat it, man. Me and old Painless here, we're watching the front door. The Nignog can play chopsticks on his drums. I don't care." As stubborn and hardened as these two were, their sense of brotherhood was critical, and they felt a need to remind themselves of it in the face of Dylan's incompetence. They were also thoroughly enjoying Dylan's outsider status, relishing the difficulty the black man was having keeping up the pace. If someone had called them on the racial slurs, they would have looked completely blank. Mac and Blaine slurred everybody. They didn't spend a lot of their free time going to weddings and christenings. Mac advanced another 10 meters, stuck his head out of the bushes to reconnoiter, then signaled slowly. The rest of the assault team moved swiftly up the hill, barely visible in the dense brush as they dispersed into defensive position. The bushes stopped just at the brow of the hill, which had been slashed and burned to serve as lookout, though no one stood sentry right now. The knoll appeared completely deserted as the commandos took stock and proceeded out of cover, crawling on their bellies across blackened ground, alive with scurrying insects. The top of the knoll was almost peaceful, certainly quieter than the surrounding jungle, the blue sky brilliant above the tropical afternoon. The men, camouflaged as much by the ash and dirt as by their combat motley, were drenched with sweat as the bare, dark ground absorbed the harsh rays of the equatorial sun, increasing the temperature just above the turf to a searing 110 degrees. Schaefer and Ramirez were the first to clear the crest of the hill, and they froze like a couple of lizards when they got a good look at the valley below. A makeshift guerrilla camp was flourishing in a grove of rubber trees. Yet the more the two men studied the operation, the less makeshift it seemed. A huge, spreading palapa covered several gun emplacements dug into the hillside. These weapon sights, descending as far as the winding stream on the valley floor, looked highly sophisticated, some of them anti-aircraft. What did the rebels think this was? Southeast Asia? Why were they so overarmed? The government wasn't hitting them that hard, was it? About 30 men moved about the camp, dressed in various combinations of jungle fatigues and jeans and t-shirts. One man had "Bruce is the boss" printed across his back. Several were armed with AK-47 assault rifles, and a heavy machine gun emplacement guarded the main approach. It was well protected and hidden from the air by the trees, and clearly larger than most of the highland camps that dotted strategic points throughout the war zone. It was even big by Nicaraguan standards. And at that moment it was being guarded by just 2 men. Schaefer, peering through field binoculars, scanned every inch of the camp below. His observation located one guard standing above the huts on the opposite slope, half asleep in the sun as he squatted over his rifle. Another guard strolled up and down by the machine gun nest at the main point of entry. It was inexplicable that they didn't have a man stationed on the knoll where Schaefer and Ramirez lay hidden, unless perhaps they had just gotten cocky, having downed a big US chopper the day before. Perhaps they were bloated and a little sleepy, like a snake who'd eaten a rat. In the camp itself, Schaefer noticed a guerrilla carrying a handheld rocket launcher, placing it beside a bandolier of rockets. He also recognized a radio set and consoles that couldn't have come from anywhere else but an American surveillance craft. Schaefer put down his glasses and looked over at Ramirez, who nodded in acknowledgement. He'd picked up the association between the equipment and the downed chopper. "Seems like we got us some target practice," murmured Schaefer with satisfaction. "Right on, Major," said Ramirez with a smile. "No women and children neither. We don't have to be too particular, you know?" Suddenly, their attention was riveted back to the camp at the sound of a muffled cry coming from behind a heavily curtained door on the largest hut. The curtain flew back violently, and a moaning hostage staggered out, shirtless and bleeding from whip wounds all over his upper body. Clearly, he'd been beaten severely for hours. His hands were tied behind his back, and he stumbled just outside the door, as if kicked from behind. He fell to the ground, feebly trying to maintain his footing. He coughed up a gout of blood, and spat it defiantly over his shoulder. A guerrilla leader emerged from the hut behind him. Tall, moustached, and packing a sidearm, he swaggered over to the beaten hostage, kicking him viciously in the stomach. Then he knelt down beside his victim, withdrew an automatic from his holster, and cocked the hammer slowly, as if to prolong the agony. He sneered something in Spanish. "You go to hell!" choked back the hostage in his captor's tongue. "Go fuck your mother's ass! She's begging for it, man!" The guerrilla grabbed the man's hair, jammed the nozzle of the gun into his ear, and with a satisfied grin, pulled the trigger. The side of the hostage's head exploded all over the curtain in front of the door. Tidiness wasn't in the guerrilla handbook. The leader shoved the dead man's head to the ground and stood up in a kind of macho exultation, gleeful as a bully in a playground. He kicked again at the body as it slumped into a lifeless heap. Then he slung the pistol back into his holster and turned and walked calmly back into his hut, taking care as he pushed aside the curtain not to soil his fingers in the carnage of blood and brains. The curtain fell back. The corpse lay unattended in the dust. None of the other guerrillas made a move to haul it away. From the look of the camp, they weren't really meticulous about any of their garbage. Schaefer, stone-faced throughout the brutal murder, lowered his glasses, a look of cold determination and hatred on his face. Ramirez moved to cross himself, and Dutch had to hold himself back from slapping Ramirez's hand aside and pounding his head in the dirt. Ramirez only had a very little bit of religion, a reflex from his childhood and his mother's daily mass, but even a little bit seemed to get under Schaefer's skin. Quickly, the two of them squirmed back down the hillside, joining the others. Schaefer made a circular motion with his forefinger, and the men gathered around him in a huddle formation. Schaefer spoke with calculated rage. "They killed one of the prisoners. I don't know how many they got left, so we take them now." Dillon nodded, as if he was still trying to prove that all orders had to be okayed by him. The rest of the men pointedly ignored him. Blaine and Mac led the way around the hillside, slithering on all fours below the level of the burn, protected by the high grass. As the going got rougher, Blaine silently slipped out his cartridge pack and ditched his beloved blaster. Then he withdrew his combat knife and gripped it between his teeth, as if he was just as glad to go into combat hand to hand. He and Mac rippled through the underbrush in tandem like a pair of stalking tigers, till suddenly Mac froze in mid-creep, the sweat pouring from his streaked face. He held up his hand, signalling Blaine to stop. Mac had spotted a hair-thin tripwire. He stretched out an arm and drew a finger along the ground about 2 inches from the wire till Blaine focused on it and nodded. Mac pointed to where the wire disappeared into a nest of reeds. He bellied over and parted the reeds with his hands, revealing a hidden claymore mine about the size of a pie plate. Grinning in anticipation of twisting the guerrilla's defense mechanism so it would backfire, Mac hunched over the mine and held his breath. Then he redirected the claymore, swiveling it a quarter turn so it faced towards the camp. Then he reattached the wires. Meanwhile, about 100 feet downwind, the observer absorbed the cells of a banana palm. It consumed the tree and at the same time replicated it perfectly. In a microsecond, there was no tree at all. It was just a thought now, in the nerve cluster of the chameleon-like invader, though even the monkeys rutting in the fronds were not aware of the transformation. The blackened bananas looked exactly the same and tasted the same to the flies. The creature sent out its radar, silent as fallout. It surveyed Blaine and Mac with its heat-seeking vision, their bodies outlined in luminous aureoles. To the invader, the electrified tripwire with their concentrated energy glowed brilliantly, even under the midday sun, standing out in high contrast relief to the jungle foliage. The being thought the men must be feeding, drinking up the current like pollinating bees. It could not understand yet what the purpose of these creatures was. Every other species seemed to fit in the scheme of things, and the invader had travelled throughout the universe to study that scheme. It had gathered specimens of each till they were stacked and filed in its mind like butterflies in a cabinet. Not man. Man was other, like the alien itself. It was as if the universe had finally dared to think up a proposition equal to the alien's capacity for wonder. And all it knew was this: it must possess them.